Everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage, and we're back for another edition of what am we doing today? This is Thyroid Answers Podcast. I almost said Thyroid Thursday. That was yesterday, and I didn't get a Thyroid Thursday done. So it's the Thyroid Answers Podcast, right? It's mid-December. We're going to do another listener Q&A. Of course, with me is Dr. Erica Riggleman, my co-host of the show. Dr. Erica, how are you today?
I'm doing great, I think that people are sitting home during this pandemic and they're thinking of all sorts of questions and we want to answer them.
Yeah, some of these are questions that maybe we've been asked and answered in the past, but if people are still asking, I think it's worth going through them again.
I agree.
Okay. So I guess without further ado, let's get at it. Let's go for them.
Yeah. So the first question coming from one of the listeners is, why does blood sugar rise when doing intermittent fasting? And I think this is a really common question that people have when, switching, especially if they're new to intermittent fasting.
Yeah. So one of the big things is, especially this can happen almost to anybody to some degree, right? So if you're not efficient at burning fat and you do some intermittent fasting and your blood sugar starts to drop, you actually have 4 hormones that should raise it, right? You have cortisol, glucagon, growth hormone, and norepinephrine. And those are all hormones that should rush in and help your body produce glucose, okay? And that can cause your blood sugar to rise. When you're doing intermittent fasting and you're really efficient at burning fats, that's typically, you're not gonna have that type of response, that kind of rush and flush, because the body's pretty adept at utilizing fats and burning fats. Now, is it potentially a problem for somebody who's got a tissue cellular hypothyroid condition? And absolutely, it can be an issue, because when you are in a fasted state, you are relying on glucose transporters to bring in that glucose. If your cells are experiencing what we call a cell danger response, the cells are perceiving excessive stress and danger, the cells are going to down-regulate those glucose transporters. They're not going to bring as much glucose into the cells, even in a fasted state. And the way those glucose transporters are regulated is with T3. So if you have less T3 inside the cell working as it should because of that cell danger response, then you're going to have less glucose transported into the muscle tissue, into the other tissues, and therefore glucose can build up in the blood. Okay, that would be the most likely answer I would give somebody.
Absolutely, I agree with that too. And I think that there's another component to that as well, is that your blood sugar may also rise for other reasons. If you have some sort of stressful event, or, I often see this where people, wake up in the morning and their blood sugar is really high. Obviously they haven't eaten anything in several hours, and it may be that your mouth breathing, that's a stressful event. Maybe that's causing a rise in cortisol, which can affect blood sugar. Maybe you got a phone call. Maybe mornings are just stressful, chaotic, and it's just, there's other factors than just the intermittent fasting that may be causing your blood sugar to rise. So if you're just checking that, it goes back to most things. There isn't just one cause. There may be a environment that is causing that to happen, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. We just have to say, okay, what are the reasons? Let's try to work on those factors, because if you're doing it in a good adapted state, your blood sugar, shouldn't be rising that much, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's just from intermittent fasting.
Yeah, and the other piece to consider is that, as you're saying, like when you wake up in the morning, you have a cortisol awakening response. So cortisol is going to rise. And as your cortisol rises, your blood sugar is going to have a tendency to go up, right? So there's many factors that play into it. It may not just be the fact that you're intermittent fasting that's part of the issue, but it may be a cascade of issues that may create the problem. But I would say for the vast majority of my clients, when we do time-restricted eating, they do much better with managing blood sugar levels than when they're eating multiple small meals per day, right? Yeah. And you hear people, I've seen that talked about in the hypothyroid community, like, hey, because I have hypothyroidism and because I have reactive hypoglycemia, I need to eat every couple hours to regulate my blood sugar. And really, all that does is continue producing a state that really requires constant levels of carbohydrates coming into the system. And it really promotes more weight gain, because if you're not able to burn off those calories that you're consuming on every 2 to 3 hours, um, you're going to have to store those extra calories. And two, why would your body ever even attempt to burn excess fat if there's constantly calories coming into the system every couple hours?
Yep.
I think really what that does is train people to be reactive hypoglycemic, insulin resistant, and it's a great training ground for becoming a diabetic over time.
Yeah, I agree. And I also suggest when people, if you're only trying, most people intermittent fast and they are restrictive eating, they're obviously skipping more of the breakfast, not eating till lunch. Sometimes I tell people, okay, well, why don't we try instead, we flip it. You eat breakfast, you eat your lunch, and then in the afternoon we stop and we kind of intermittent fast in the evening and through the night. And sometimes that's a little bit better. So I think each person at the timing wise of intermittent fasting can be, appropriate for different people.
Yeah, I think some of the science in the literature seems to show that it may be better to do eating first thing in the morning and then lunch and then take that longer fast through the evening. But I typically tend to be a morning faster. Why? Because it's during the week, I'm up, nobody else is up. I can get my workout, get everything else done. And then I have my social eating with my family at dinner, right? It's a time to have a social engagement. I think that's really important. But I love breakfast. So, that's my favorite meal. So I may bump my breakfast to lunch, but on days like on the weekends, then I may eat breakfast and lunch and maybe not have an afternoon, an evening meal. But yeah, I think people have to find their groove when it comes to time restricted eating or intermittent fasting and see what works. I guess we should talk about one other piece on that. And that is that people have this conception or belief that time restricted eating or intermittent fasting is detrimental or problematic if you have hypothyroidism, because it's going to cause a danger signal, a starvation signal, and therefore it's going to make your hypothyroidism worse. So you've heard that, I'm sure, right?
Absolutely.
I just don't see that happening, right? So when you do time restricted eating and you're creating satiety signals in the brain, and the brain, that danger signal goes away. I think time restricted eating, 1 to 2 meals per day, or I have a patient right now who's doing 24-hour fasts as part of her process and is feeling fantastic. So I think in 3 weeks, she's lost about 16 pounds. She feels great. Is it terrible? No. I mean, she feels great. Why would her body, if she's getting satiety signals once or twice a day, then that longer period of fast, even that 24-hour fasting period, her body is now dipping into fat stores. So we didn't just see weight loss like where we didn't want it. That weight loss is coming off that belly, that midsection. That's where inches have been lost. So I think it's really important when we talk about intermittent fasting, time restricted eating, and people saying that it's potentially problematic for those with hypothyroidism. I think we can't just make a blanket statement like that. I think for the individual, if they're doing it right and they're creating satiety signals, intermittent fasting or time restricted eating, however you want to say it, can be a very effective tool to help your body start to burn some of the excess fat. You have to remember, if you have a tissue hypothyroid state or a hypothyroid state in general, your metabolism is slowed down anyway. So it's not burning as much fuel as it once did. Your thoughts?
No, I totally agree. I think where people get into a situation where they think it's detrimental, I think is in the category where they're trying to do intermittent fasting. And then when they do their feeding window, they're not eating enough calories, or they're eating very small meals, they're only maybe eating 500 calories in that meal. I think that's where over time, your body will think that you're going into starvation because you're not meeting a caloric intake at a certain period of time to satisfy those centers where you get the right signals. And so I think that is a deadly combo of doing intermittent fasting and restricting your calories when you eat. I think that's where people can get into trouble. And when you don't know a lot about it and you're used to eating, only, 200-300 calories in a meal, because that's what we've been taught, we're trying to lose weight. You don't eat that when you're intermittent fasting. You try to get good nutrient dense foods and get your calories in that feeding window. So I think that if you do that properly, it's not a detrimental to your thyroid physiology.
Absolutely. All right. What's next?
So this kind of spins off that last question, but why is fasting blood sugar high if insulin is low?
So a couple of things could be going on in a situation where somebody has a low fasting insulin, right? High fasting blood sugar, and their insulin could be low.
Yeah.
So if they're in a fasted state, we talked about you need thyroid hormone T3 inside the cells in sufficient quantities to actually support transport of glucose into the cells, okay? If you have a cellular hypothyroid state and you have and you have reduced T3 inside the cell, those in the non-fed state or in the fasted state, those glucose transporters aren't working as efficiently. They're not bringing in as much glucose. So stress or other factors could raise your blood sugar, but then you have a harder time getting that sugar in a fasted state into the cells and tissues. And so that could be one reason. I think the other reason that we sometimes see is that, and it kind of does tie to eating. We talked about this before, is that we see people who have reactive hypoglycemia, right? They may not necessarily have high insulin, but they have these kind of ebbs and flows of their blood sugar. And if they have a problem in the GI tract, dysbiosis, leaky gut issues, damage to the gut lining, the enzyme GLP-1 can be reduced. And GLP-1 is what should signal the initial release of insulin when somebody starts eating. And if they've lost that first phase insulin response, they're going to eat, their blood sugar is going to rise, their insulin is going to surge late, and they're going to get a plummeting of their blood sugar. Then you're going to see the reactive phase. Cortisol, norepinephrine, glucagon, growth hormone may all drive up to raise blood sugar in that state. And they may have been, 2-3 hours post-prandial. They're looking at their blood sugar saying it's high. I haven't eaten in an extended period of time. Why is my sugar high? My insulin is low. And it could be just this reactive hypoglycemic response. And that may be it. I see a lot of people who have reactive hypoglycemic symptoms when we do their fasting blood chemistries. I'd see a lot of these people have higher fasting blood sugars, but low and sometimes really low insulin levels. I think
and then those are typically the people who I've got to eat my meat, several meals throughout the day or else I feel terrible. Because when you have those huge, peaks and valleys in your blood sugar or even insulin levels, you're going to feel kind of crummy. And
depending on what we see, I mean, you could have blood sugar could be really high, it could be mildly high. We can take a look at hemoglobin A1C to see what the long-term impact of glucose is. Is hemoglobin A1C relatively low, or is it getting more to what we would diagnose as a pre-diabetic or a diabetic state? But remember, you need T3 as well to make insulin. So if you have problems with T3 getting to maybe the pancreas, not only may you may not have as much insulin production. So that can play a role as well.
Yeah. So this next question is a very, very common one, obviously being people who see thyroid patients. We see this quite often are T4, T3 meds bad?
Yeah. And I think this question comes because I often bad talk, I guess, to some degree, T4, T3 meds and T3 only medication. So I don't think they're bad, right?
No, and I don't think so either.
If you have good cellular thyroid physiology, if your body's in a state of homeostasis, there's no significant cell danger response going on, there's no problem with transport of T4 and T3 into the tissues, then T4, T3 combination may be fine, right? You may do really well on it. I've seen people do well on it. I'm sure you've seen people do well on it. I think the reason I give it more of a hard time is because of the scenario we typically see people getting to T4 and T3 combo, like Armor or Nature Thyroid or NP Thyroid, or we see them getting to a T4 and T3 and pulsing and taking both of those things as separate medications. So if you had, when we talk about hypothyroidism, right, we often talk about cellular hypothyroidism, like tissue control of what happens to thyroid hormone. Everybody thinks that, or a lot of people think that thyroid physiology is really regulated by how much thyroid hormone is pumped out by the gland or how much medication you take. And everything in the bloodstream is going to go into the cells. And as long as you have enough in the bloodstream, everything should work. But really, your individual tissues and cells have control. So if my liver wants to slow down metabolism, it has the ability to decrease thyroid hormone production or conversion. It doesn't bring as much thyroid hormone in. It starts deactivating some of the thyroid hormone when it reaches the cell. My muscle tissues have individual control. Cardiac tissue, whatever the tissues are, all the individual tissues ultimately have their own control of thyroid hormone regulation and metabolism based on what their needs are. If I need to ramp up the metabolism of the GI tract, I don't necessarily need my brain ramped up at that very moment. So individual tissues have to have control. So when we talk about what really causes hypothyroid symptoms, we talk about lack of thyroid hormone at the tissue level. Some people would say, well, that only happens when the thyroid gland can't make enough. When the thyroid gland has lost 90% of its function and there's not enough T4 or T3 in circulation, then you have hypothyroid symptoms because that's when there isn't sufficient thyroid hormone in the tissues. Well, that's just not true if all the tissues have individual control. So if I have a liver that's experiencing cell danger response, cell stress response, that the liver is going to have decreased thyroid hormone T3 inside binding to receptors. That's not a mistake. That's part of normal protective physiology. So if you have multiple tissues that have a cell danger response going on, then when you if none of the tissues have that and you take T4, that T4 should be fine. You should be good on T4. T4 is going to get into the system, it's going to be converted, and you're going to make T3 inside the cells and you should be good. And there's lots of people that have glandular hypothyroidism, maybe their cell stress or cell danger responses that, or whatever the cause of their hypothyroidism, their cellular peripheral thyroid physiology works. So they take T4 and they feel fine. However, if they take T4 and they feel a little bit better, that's because some is better than none. And so they get some to the tissues, but they still don't feel well or they plateau because the cells are still causing that thyroid hormone to be deactivated versus converted to T3. And so if you feel good and you get the plateau and then you take some more and you feel good and you plateau and you feel good, then people wind up going, well, T4 obviously doesn't work. I have a conversion issue. My body's broken. My cells are broken. I've got genetic problems. I got selenium deficiency. So I'm going to take T4 and T3. And guess what? Initially, they feel better because if you weren't making T3 or converting T3 well, and now you give somebody T3, they're probably going to feel better for a bit. But then they plateau. Why? Because the cells are going, hey, we really don't want all this T3. We're trying to that's why we weren't converting T4 to T3. So now they're going to start deactivating some of the T3. And so then they have to increase the dose and increase the dose. And we're back into this scenario. And then they go to somebody else and somebody else says, well, listen, that Armor stuff is no good. That NP Thyroid stuff is no good. You can't predict what's in there. It's, so we're going to give you T4 and we're going to give you some T3. And guess what? Initially, they feel better, right? And then after a while, they plateau, and then they need more, and then they plateau, and they need more. And they're thinking, it's good because it helped me, right? It can temporarily help them, right? Is there somebody who really has a genetic problem converting T4 to T3? Maybe, but they're probably not here. Because if they had a congenital defect in the transporters of T4 to T3, we know there's some pretty severe consequences of that. So that's probably not the primary mechanism. What's probably going on for the person who does okay on T4 in the beginning and then needs to keep changing the doses and then needs to switch from T4 to T3 and then switches from a blend to a T4 capsule and a T3 capsule. What the problem likely is they have a thyroid allostatic condition going on where their body is trying not to increase the metabolism. Some hormone feels good, but then their body realizes that, hey, I got to keep trying to slow metabolism and keep deactivating it. So I'm not anti-T4. I'm not anti-T4, T3. I'm not anti-T4 and T3. But I think if you're trying to manage symptoms, great. But I just don't see that working for the vast majority of people. I think for the vast majority of people who have good cellular tissue thyroid physiology, the T4 can work just fine.
Yeah. And I think that people often are, when they, like, for example, they come to work with me, or I'm sure come work with you, they're under the assumption that if we fix everything, I shouldn't need the medication. And I don't want people to think that at all. I always preface that as, you know, we're going to try to fix all this physiology. You may still need to be on medication, and that's okay. Well, we have to get you to a point where it's not take it for a little bit, then I got to increase my dose, and then it stops working again. That's where you get in kind of that vicious cycle, is because something's still broken. And so you can't use whether you're on medication or not as a good thing or not. I've had patients that have gone through a whole program and they feel fabulous, but they're like, yeah, well, I'm still on medication. Okay. Your body, it's what, you can't look at that as a bad thing either. And so I think that it's used inappropriately in a lot of situations where they're using the medication to manage the symptoms and they're not actually getting to that root cause.
Yeah. I think when it comes to that, people need, a big piece of it is that by the time you're diagnosed with glandular or primary hypothyroidism, you've lost 90% of the function of the gland. Is it possible that you could feel better and still need thyroid medication? Yeah, because you've probably had a 12, 20-year thyroid problem at the gland where it's been damaged for that period of time. And if it's going to heal and improve, and now we have some science that shows that the cells can heal, improve, and even regrow, which is great. Maybe you get some function back and actually maybe need less thyroid hormone in the future, or maybe not need it at all. But ultimately, the goal should be, as Erica said, is reducing the things that are creating the excessive stress so that the thyroid hormone you get actually works better. Now, I do see a lot of people that come to see me, and when they tell me, hey, I want to get off this stuff, that's not my primary goal either. The primary goal is to get them healthy, but I do see a lot of people need to change, reduce, and for some, eliminate their thyroid medication because the root cause issues are addressed. And I mean, like, really getting to the root issues. We're seeing that their cell danger response is improving across the board on multiple. And when we take a look at multiple labs, signs and symptoms are improved, weight's improving, fat mobilization's improving. And so we're seeing all those changes. So it's not unusual to see people need sometimes less in time, but you shouldn't look at it as a failure if you still need a level of thyroid hormone support, because if you've addressed everything else and you feel great, but you had 20 or 30 or 40 years of your gland atrophying, yeah, it may not be able to fully come back and give you enough. So some could be good. As far as the T4, T3, T3, I think the analogy I use quite a bit with my patients is if your car wasn't running well because you had bad spark plugs, would it matter if the car ran out of gas, right? Would it matter whether it was high test, right? T4, whether it was a blend like T4, T3, or just T3? The type of gas wouldn't really matter, right? It still wouldn't run well. Just doesn't matter which gas it was because the spark plugs are bad. But if you didn't have any gas, all of them would be good initially, but you'd be like, okay, now it starts. Awesome, car drive. Okay, now I can drive it. But it still doesn't run well, right? All right, well, next time I run out of gas, I'm going to try a different one. And you try the different one. Hey, it starts. Awesome, right? And now you start driving, you go, but it still doesn't run well, right? So it's that same kind of idea or scenario. You have to address the issue. Often, the reduction of thyroid hormone is the result of what's going on in the body, not the primary issue, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. Next question is, keto makes me feel worse.
Yeah, is that possible?
Oh, I absolutely believe it could be. I think there's many reasons why that can happen. I think that, people who transition, into a keto diet, that's any diet that you transition into, there may be a period of time of transitioning where your body has to get used to it. Keto in itself, they even call it the keto flu. I've seen a lot of people never go through it. I've also seen people where it lasts weeks, maybe even months of your body trying to figure out, okay, you're eating all these fats. How do we burn them when it's only used to burning sugar or glucose?
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of things here, right? So if you're hypothyroid and you go from carbohydrates to a fat-based diet and you can't burn fats because your tissues are hypothyroid, right? So burning fat efficiently is really an aerobic process, right? To be most efficient. And we're driving those fats into something called your Krebs cycle and into your mitochondria to generate energy. And so you can get a lot of efficiency burning fats. The problem is you need a sufficient level of thyroid hormone T3 in the cells for that to happen. If you have excessive cell stress, if you have tissue or cellular hypothyroidism, you don't have a lot of T3 in the system to drive mitochondrial function. Matter of fact, that part of that cell danger response is to decrease your what we call your Krebs cycle and your electron transport chain to generate this super efficient energy. Because that takes too long. So what the body does in favor of that is use energy processes, and we won't get into the heavy chemistry, that don't rely on that Krebs cycle primarily to generate most of our energy. So that's one reason. Hey, I'm hypothyroid. I'm expecting my mitochondria is going to work really good. But that's just not going to happen. Okay. And your cells are actually reducing mitochondrial number and efficiency as part of the cell danger response. The second reason is you probably have a gut issue going on. And when you change from a higher carbohydrate-based diet to a fat-based diet, you're going to have a mismatch between the organisms that are primarily kind of predominating in the gut and the food you're putting in there. So that can create an issue. Third issue is that if you have a hypothyroid condition, your ability to produce things like pancreatic enzymes and bile are probably deficient or less functional. So you put a bunch of fat into a system that can't break it down and digest it well, yeah, you're probably not going to feel so good. You may have, you may even get like poopy pants, right? Because you can't deal with the excessive levels of fat. So could they be a good switch? They could help, but if you feel terrible on keto, and I've seen this multiple times, you're probably not going to feel so good. And you see a lot of people like, hey, I've been doing keto, I've been doing keto and CrossFit. And I'm gaining, I'm not losing any weight. I'm stronger, but I'm not losing any weight. Why do you think? I'm actually heavier than I was before, still tired, still fatigued. Well, you are doing a really aggressive exercise program, which I think is great if you're optimally healthy. But but it's probably adding to the stress. You're probably doing CrossFit every day of the week because now you're part of this community. So you're probably not allowing for the proper rest and recovery. And as a person with chronic hypothyroid stuff, you need more time for rest and recovery. And then you're pounding down a bunch of fats that you can't digest. So it's a recipe for a potential disaster. Could you do well? Absolutely, you could do well. But if you have so many other things going on, and then you add really aggressive exercise and a lot high fat diet that your body's not really ready to utilize, you're probably gonna feel like crap.
Yeah, and I also think that keto has been commercialized, and so sometimes when people say that they're eating a keto diet, they're eating extremely processed foods. I mean, there's nothing, you're not eating like good fats. You may be eating keto cookies and keto ice cream, and you're eating all of these things that, and a lot of them contain, sugar alcohols, which can affect the digestive tract and can cause bloating and gas and, all sorts of symptoms that may make you not feel well. And if you've never had a gut problem and to begin with, like symptom wise, you may have had a gut problem, just not had symptoms. You may be wondering like, why do I feel so terrible on this? It's because you're eating food that's really not food.
Yeah, you know what? And I think what gets missed when people do that, right, is that they think it's better because it's keto, right? But they're missing the point. You're still snacking 4 or 5 times a day, right? You're still eating a bunch of things that are trying to kind of satiate that kind of sugar almost craving, right? So you haven't necessarily maybe changed behavior. You just changed the food, right? So you still could be over consuming foods. You could still be eating a lot of processed foods. You could still be eating things that aren't necessarily the best. Eating more than you really need. And it's, we kind of beat up the vegetarians because they're eating a bunch of processed, artificial frankenfood sometimes. And yet we're doing the same thing many times in these other kind of food religion groups, right? I think that part's nonsense. I think the idea of keto makes sense, right? But I think for the most part, and my philosophy doesn't change too much on this on a regular basis, 80% of the times, if you're in a relatively good state of health, and I say relatively because we don't have a great definition of what health is, but if you're a relatively healthy person, above average health, not taking any medications, seem to be doing pretty good, and you're eating or you're taking thyroid medication, but everything else seems to be pretty good. If you eat healthy, whole, real food, right? Some time restricted eating, lots of healthy water, good mindset, good diet, 80% of the time, your habits, we've talked about this before, are really good, then you could be able and should be able to enjoy life a little bit, I think, right? The problem is that, especially for things like keto, people get into some of these dietary programs and they are like blinders on, religious about what it is, and they can't, I don't know what's the saying, they can't see the forest from the trees. They can't, because it's keto, right? They can't see that they still may be making dietary mistakes with what they're eating because it's got the almighty keto label on it or paleo label on it, right? And so, I think from a behavior standpoint, we have to keep in mind that we should be focused on whole food, real food, first and foremost, versus, what can I make and slap a label on it and get away with calling it, healthy. Meanwhile, it's just loaded with a whole bunch of things I can't pronounce.
Yeah, we saw that when people moved into the gluten-free. All of these are considered fad diets because there's a market for it. People market it. And again, we saw it with gluten-free. There's gluten-free Oreos. There's gluten-free this. And I mean, I know in my grocery store, there's a whole keto section now. And it's a way for these companies to make money, and people think because it says keto on the label, again, they think it's healthy and I'm going to eat it. And again, they can, without having to change their dietary habits, it's just switching from one processed diet to another processed diet to another processed diet. And sometimes you have to say, okay, what am I really eating? Let's try to get back to the real food. If it still comes in a package, it may still be processed.
Yeah. And I think when people talk about how expensive it is to eat healthy, I think it's really not that expensive to eat healthy if you're actually eating healthy, right? But if you're buying a lot of air quotes healthy processed food, junk food, that stuff is expensive, right? So when you're talking about, hey, I bought a burger or I bought a steak, is it a little bit more expensive to buy that, organic grass-fed meat? Absolutely it is. But if you're eating that, and let's say you are eating like, sweet potato or something like that and some vegetables, if you're eating that, you're eating fairly clean and you're not buying all the other stuff, probably just as expensive as somebody who's purchasing food on the standard American diet, because they're buying a lot of other things to fill the sugar cravings.
Yeah. I mean, for example, you can buy in the keto diet, pork rinds are huge. There is a little like 4-ounce bag of pork rinds that costs like,
$27.
yeah, it's like almost $10 for that little bag. And you could sit down in like 2 minutes and eat the whole bag.
And
So,
we're suckers because
yep.
we think it's worth more because it's paleo or keto or vegetarian, right? It's got a healthy label on it, or it's been something approved, right? So hey, if it was just not a healthy food, right? It was considered this is junk food, you wouldn't pay the same amount for that, right?
Yep.
But for some reason we look at that and we go, oh, those are almonds, and those are organic keto approved almonds. Oh, those are probably worth twice as much.
Yep. Yeah.
All right, I think we beat that one to death.
That's the whole industry. I wish I would have done a whole keto line. I'd be rich. Next question, and we kind of touched on this one. It seems I need to keep increasing my T3 dose just like T4. Why?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to what we said before. If you're seeing a need to continually increase the dose, then you have this level of cell and tissue hypothyroidism going on, okay? Because it's coming into the body and it's being deactivated. So T4 will get deactivated if there's tissue hypothyroidism. T3 will be deactivated if there's tissue hypothyroidism going on. Initially, you'll feel good, and then your body's going to figure it out and start deactivating it. The problem with that T3, when you take T3, is you can't see the deactivation, right? We're not measuring any T2s, so we can't see it.
Yeah. This next one, you kind of touched on this earlier too, but we'll kind of put it into a concise question. Is the reason I don't feel well on T4 meds because I have a genetic problem with the MCT8 transporter?
I would say most people, if you look at your genetics, could you find SNPs in the transporters? Absolutely you could. Is it likely that your main reason for having hypothyroidism in your 20s or your 30s or your 40s is that you primarily have a problem with the genetic transporter, or a genetic problem with the transporter? The answer is probably no. Okay. If that was going to be the primary cause of your hypothyroidism, that would have been a congenital issue, and we know there's pretty significant issues of having that early in life. Could there be some epigenetic factors that are affecting the transport of T4 and T3 into your cells? Absolutely. That's what we talk about all the time on this podcast, is there's epigenetic influences that change how much T4 or T3 is transported into the system. So if you're saying, hey, I just can't transport it, I must have a genetic defect. No, you probably have epigenetic factors that are telling the cells, don't bring more in. You have cell danger response. You have toxicity. You have infection. Something is regulating those transporters. It's not inherently a genetic issue if you're 40 and you develop hypothyroidism.
Yeah, I think people look to blame that one thing, and they think, oh, the genes are set in stone. It has to be my genetics. Well, the genes are just a loaded gun. The environment and your lifestyle pulls that trigger. So there's something that epigenetics is playing a role. And we see this with MTHFR and other genes out there where people are looking for that one thing to blame. And it's complicated. It's not that one thing. It's the things that influence that that play a role in it. So yeah, it's not a death sentence. If you have a genetic thing, there are things that you can do. The epigenetics can be worked on, which we talk about all the time.
Yeah, it is. I think the one thing is sexy, right? And it's usually the last thing you read, right? Oh, this is the new thing. This must be the thing. But we talk about this all the time. It's the load. It is not the thing. And so I had a conversation with somebody on Discovery Call the other day, and they were like, listen, when I remove gluten, I feel better. I don't feel all the way better, but I feel better. And then um, and then I add a little bit, and then I get worse again. And so what's going on? I'm like, you have a certain amount of stress that the cells can handle. And so let's say 0 to 10. When you get to a stress level of 10, the cells have that danger response kick off. When you have rest, recovery, and stressors go away, and you bring that stress level down to a 0, you've got a lot more ability to manage a lot more stress. But most people are hanging around the 9, right? They're just sub threshold. So they remove something, they can feel a little bit better, but then they're always back into that danger response. So they never fully heal. Or they'll say, hey, I did this and I felt better for a couple months, and then it started coming back again because they never really got out of the cell danger response. They reduced some of the stress, but they're either sub-threshold, they're right about that level of excessive cell stress, or they're not in excessive cell stress, but they haven't reduced the stress enough that their cells feel confident to go into a healing response, which becomes really important. Just because you're out of that immediate danger doesn't mean that your cells automatically go back into optimal repair mode. I gave the example to a person, like if they were cooking food and somebody came in and attacked their family, are you going to protect them? And they said, absolutely, I'm going to go protect them. And I said, when do you stop protecting them? Well, when the threat's gone. Like the immediate threat, or are you going to say, if it was just one attacker, are you going to, once that one attacker's down, are you going to be off guard then? Or are you going to be super cautious until the police come, check the rest of the premises, make sure nobody else is in the house, nobody else is outside? You're probably going to stay in that protective mode or very cautious mode until you're convinced that the danger's gone. Then you go back to your normal daily activities, right?
Yeah.
And so, the cells may behave the same way. Hey, a little bit of the danger response is gone, but we still should be on guard just in case, right?
Yeah.
And so there's still other stressors creating to it. So they're just kind of hanging around threshold.
Yeah, it's totally that load. Then you have to look at that way. It's never that one thing. It's the load that you're putting on the body. So, if you remove the gluten the way that you are and then work on another piece of it, you may be able to get that below that. That's why, again, there's multiple pieces that you want to work on. There's multiple things filling up that bucket.
Right. And I think the people say, hey, I did gluten-free, that didn't work. So I put the gluten back in and I started working on something else. No.
You're not getting it below that threshold.
Right. You're only just removing a little bit. You're just below threshold and then you're coming back. So yeah, if you remove gluten, good. Now we work on gut dysbiosis. That's good. That brings that threshold down. Now we work on your sleep. Oh, that brings that lower. Now we work on your breathing. That brings it lower. Now we get that stress load down to a point where the cells are starting to go, okay, it's okay to start to heal and repair. It's okay to start to having cell-to-cell communication again. And now physiology actually starts to heal and repair. You actually start to feel good. You actually need less thyroid hormone to try and feel well. And you start to see that, hey, my signs and symptoms are doing better. My hair's growing. I'm burning fat. That's how you're going to get better. We may work on things, and in my practice, we're working typically on 1 or 2 things at a time. And that doesn't mean those are the only 2 important things, but you can only really do 1 or 2 things effectively at the same time before it seems overwhelming. So we want to keep working on each of these things, kind of pulling things off the stack, off that load. And as we make that load or that pile smaller of things that are creating stress, that's when the body actually starts to heal and repair.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question is going to be about some lab values. If taking T3 decreases reverse T3, why do I still have hypothyroid symptoms?
Okay. So if you're taking T3, the likelihood is your T4 is going to be lower. If your T4 is low, you can't make reverse T3. So the philosophy is that if you have high reverse T3, many people in functional medicine believe that if you have high reverse T3, it blocks T3 from binding to nuclear mitochondrial receptors. I have not seen a paper that actually states that yet. But what reverse T3 can do is it can block the receptors on the outside of the cell. They're called integrin receptors. But if you have T4 getting deactivated, reverse T3, what should that tell you? That should tell you that the cell is trying to lower its cellular metabolism. It's trying to deactivate thyroid hormone. Reverse T3 is not the problem. It is the sign that there's this stress mechanism going on at the tissue level. So when you take T3 instead of T4, you can't make reverse T3 because T3 doesn't convert to it. So the same mechanisms going on, that this deactivation, this slowing down of the cell metabolism, T3 is going to be deactivated as well. The problem is you're just not measuring it. We don't measure that at conventional labs. And so you're just not seeing it. The benefit to some degree of T3 is that one of the forms of T3 can actually be really effective at continuing to maintain some mitochondrial function, to maintaining some of the cell metabolism. So your cells don't completely turn off metabolism. They don't completely turn off cell physiology. What they do is they down-regulate, almost like a dimmer switch, okay? The problem with T3 from my perspective is that when you have cell stress going on and you typically have an upregulation of T4 to T3 in the hypothalamus, an area in your brain, and when that can get saturated very quickly because the hypothalamus receptors are 10 times more sensitive than the peripheral tissues. When the hypothalamus gets saturated, TRH drops, TSH drops. Now you're going to get less thyroid hormone production or stimulation of thyroid hormone production at the gland, but you also get the increased activation of what's called your sympathetic nervous system. So you essentially ramp up your fight or flight system, and you wind up getting signals to the peripheral body to further deactivate something called deiodinase 2, which is the converting enzyme of T4 to T3. The cells are getting a signal, hey, we're flooded with T3. We don't need to convert any more T4 to T3. So it almost becomes a double whammy, okay? So that's really what's going on. You still have cellular hypothyroidism going on. You think the reverse T3 is causing the cellular hypothyroidism. It's not. That's just a sign that it's going on. So taking the T3 doesn't fix that cellular hypothyroidism.
Yeah, and just getting one lab value into normal range, it isn't about just one value. You have to look at the whole picture. That's why we recommend people get a full thyroid comprehensive panel and other markers to be able to see the full picture as opposed to one just little marker, because any little marker can get back into range, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be in optimal physiology.
Yeah, we talked about insulin resistance earlier. I mean, if you have high fasting blood sugar and you have high insulin and you're taking T3, guess what? You still have a thyroid issue in the cells, right? If you have fatty liver going on at your, whether your AST, ALT, GGT is elevated, whether triglycerides are elevated, cholesterol is elevated, whether VLDL is elevated, if you have indications of fatty liver going on, yet you're on thyroid hormone, you still don't have sufficient thyroid hormone in the liver, despite maybe having lowered your reverse T3.
Yeah. All right, last question. I was able to get my TSH normalized after 60 days of working with a practitioner and getting the GI track. Now my TSH is too low and T4 too high. What happened?
So this is this is a scenario. It's actually a patient of mine asked this question. And what happened was she'd been managed for years with thyroid hormone medication. And it was always like 3, 4 Didn't matter how much thyroid hormone she got. It never got into normal range. So they tried different doses. They tried different blends of thyroid replacement therapy. And so when we started working together, we talked about a lot of scenarios we talked about today. Hey, you tried T4, it felt good, had to increase it. Then that didn't work anymore. So then they switched to a blend and wound up continually increasing the T3 portion of the medication dose, and still, TSH never really got back into range. What did we do? We made some diet and lifestyle changes, took a look at her gut with a GI map test. I started identifying the dysbiosis that was in the gut, and guess what happened? She started absorbing more of the thyroid hormone. So her TSH plummeted. It went from like 3, 4 down to under 1. So what happened? T4 jumped. What happened? She was absorbing more of the thyroid hormone. So I think we've actually had her prescribing doctor now. I think we're on our 3rd reduction of thyroid hormone, and we're making the transition to get totally off of the T3 and just go to T4 at this point. And if she didn't have like a little anxiousness, a little anxiety, a little insomnia, I would probably have left a small amount of maybe T3, maybe. But because of those symptoms, we just want to get rid of the T3 altogether and go to like a tyrosine.
Yeah, and I think this is a prime example of just because your labs are changing in I wouldn't necessarily even a negative, but they're changing in a direction that maybe not where you wanted them to go, isn't a bad thing. That's telling us that something's happening. Okay, now we evaluate this. This is the next step. And that's actually a good thing. That means that the body, something's changing in the body to be able to start absorbing that, and we're moving some of those numbers. And I think that that's a great thing, not necessarily a bad thing, but other people other practitioners may try to spin that like, oh no, they're making you worse, or, whatever it may be.
Yeah, so fortunately, we've got a physician who's on board with what we're working on. But however, I have had physicians like, hey, we had your TSH stable, and now it's not stable because of these dietary changes and stuff and these supplements you're taking. That's where I think we really struggle, because if the patient lost 20, 25 pounds in the 60 days since you saw them, maybe something's is working, right? Maybe they don't need the same dose of medication, right? So I just sometimes think we get a narrow vision of things. I do want to build off of something you said, and that is that labs changing is not necessarily a problem, right? And the reason for that is because we're not necessarily, in functional medicine at least, we should not be trying to play whack-a-mole with lab values, right? To hammer them back into a range. The lab value should be interpreted. It's telling us something. So it tells us we're changing. So what Erica's saying is, hey, if you do something and TSH changes or T4 changes or 3T4 changes, you have to look at that and say, okay, what should that mean? Sometimes, like we're working on somebody's gut physiology, and you give them an antimicrobial, and now they went from being constipated to having loose stools, and they may think that's bad. That just may be a die-off reaction. So it doesn't mean that the treatment's bad. It may mean that, hey, we're progressing a little bit quickly. Maybe we need a binder, but that may be exactly what we want to do, is see some change in the GI tract. When you do a dietary change, hey, I went from excessive carbohydrate diet to keto or carnivore, and now I've got a headache and I'm exhausted. This is a terrible diet. No, you are coming off your carbohydrate detox, and you're not. This should be a wake-up call that you were primarily fueling your body on one primary source, and you weren't very adept at burning fat. You gave up caffeine, and now you've got migraines. It's caffeine, maybe that's a bad thing to do. No, that means you are probably not reacting well to that. It almost became excessive, drug use, I guess we could say. So we have to stop looking at the changes that the body gives as the problem and start interpreting what those things might mean. And it's important to build on that, is that just the interpretation is going to be different for a couple different people. If you got headaches and I got headaches, those headaches could be caused by different reasons. So we need to interpret what you did differently versus what I did differently, so we can understand what the mechanism of action that may have created the headache. You may have a headache because you're dehydrated, you're not drinking enough water. I may have a headache because I eliminated caffeine. What are we trying to address? We may not need to change anything. We may not need to treat or manage anything. We just need to understand the mechanism. And if it's giving up caffeine, we don't necessarily need to treat it. I get it. If you're really hurting, you can do something, but we understand the mechanism of action. And we go, okay, this is a temporary thing. You got to struggle through this process and you'll be okay. Or, hey, you have these symptoms, you're dehydrated. Your labs show you're dehydrated. You're not drinking enough water. Yes, you could take Advil every day, but that doesn't fix the issue, right? So could you just, everybody take Advil for their headache? Yes. Does that fix the problem? No, but it's a physician who should be interpreting why you have those signs and symptoms, not just trying to treat them or manage them. Now, be fair. If somebody goes into the doctor and doesn't want to address the root causes, that's exactly what allopathic medicine is about. Hey, I don't want to necessarily address it. Just give me something to manage it. That's the beauty of allopathic medicine. If I get in a car accident and I'm bleeding out, don't take me for selenium. I want something to stop the bleeding, right? But if you really want to get well, you're not going to drug yourself healthy. It's just not going to happen.
I agree.
All right, I think we're good,
Yes,
right?
I think
Awesome.
we answered lots of questions.
So I think we'll wrap it up today. I do want to let you know that I've had a lot of, been talking to a lot of people from all over the world, Argentina,
Oh, wow.
New Zealand, Australia,
You mean
Sweden.
people have thyroid problems all over the world?
They do. It's hard to believe. Yeah, it's hard to believe. I think the biggest challenge I have sometimes is I get people who call, and our language barrier is the issue, right? I wish I had stayed awake and paid attention in some of those foreign language classes I took in school, because that would have been really helpful. But the good news is people are talking about the podcast. Everybody who I've been talking to says, hey, I listened to the podcast. I love the podcast. There's so much information. So for everybody who's listening, we appreciate it. Keep downloading it. Keep sharing it with your friends and family. And if there's questions that you want answered, obviously reach out to Dr. Erica or myself and let us know what questions you have, and we'll be more than happy to answer them. And if you could do us a favor, go to wherever you download your podcast and check as many stars as you think the quality of our presentation's worth. The more you rate us, the higher we rank, and the more people will join and follow. Last piece, and I'm going to make a post on this, a video post on this later. People have been asking me about the thyroid debacle. When's it coming out? When's it coming out? Because of some challenges with the publisher and COVID and a number of things, we were hoping to have it ready in December. It looks, we're still looking for, we're now going to push that out a little bit. We're looking for probably the first quarter of 2021, but we're getting close. It's just with everything going on, most people realize there's some type of this virus thing going on. Things are a little bit, little hectic, little slower, and this industry is no different. Okay.
All right.
All right. So we'll sign off, Dr. Erica. Always good to see you. Enjoy the holidays if I don't talk to you sooner. And everybody else, all our listeners, have a great holiday.
Yeah. Have a great holiday.